We now come to a very special session of the 3 days in May, and that is the St. Gallen Wings of Excellence Award. The Wings of Excellence Award is an essay competition which is entered by roughly over 1,000 people, and the 200 who are judged to be the best essayists are then invited to this symposium. They come from 50 different countries, leading universities across the world. The support for this has been given by PricewaterhouseCoopers and Swiss Re. Last year, we said goodbye to the person who had chaired this event for a long time, Gilbert Probst. And today, I am just going to introduce the chairman, who will then take over. The chairman is a Norwegian from Oslo, who's now lived in Switzerland for more than 15 years, I think. He was formerly a professor here in St. Gallen, and he's now the head of the Department of Management, Technology and Economics at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, which is a very well-known academic institution with 21 Nobel laureates. He's consulted widely with companies. He also serves on the board of the Swiss American Chamber of Commerce, the European Academy of Management, and he's published widely in the field. And I'd now like to hand over to Professor Dr. Georg von Krogh. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, Lord Griffith. It is a great pleasure for me to assume the role as chairman of the main jury of the St. Gallen Wings of Excellence Award. This is a great honor because of my warm relationship to the University of St. Gallen, the great admiration for the mission of the St. Gallen Symposium, and the very impressive work of students and professionals who make this event possible. To many, and to us, and at least to 3 people sitting on stage, the Wings of Excellence Award represents the peak of the St. Gallen Symposium. The award is an important institution within the symposium that demonstrates one of its core values, to foster a rich dialogue between current and future generations of leaders. The term excellence characterizes the award. It may stand for ethical and intellectual virtues pursued by leadership in society and economy. Thus, to win an excellence award shows that one is not only able to write really well, it also shows that someone has the ability to observe current events, develop ideas, and reflect on values. The topic of revival of political economic boundaries triggered ideas and essays in the first round from around 1,000 students from different universities around the world. That's a huge number. Why did also as a professor, knowing that sometimes it's hard to get students to, hand in the term papers, this is really quite amazing. So why this huge interest? And I think because the topic carries both a flag of opportunity, but first and foremost a sign of warning. Let us think about opportunities. Political boundaries are drawn between states and political subunits, such as municipalities. An opportunity of political boundaries is the enabled plurality of nationally diverse regulation and policies. These boundaries open for testing out alternative policies and regulatory measures, and the method of trial and error that plurality offers somehow kind of safeguards distinctiveness. In this sense, we ought to think of Friedrich Hayek's defense of experimentation and competition between different alternatives as the path towards progress of mankind. However, the theme of the revival of economic and political boundaries carries many, many warning signs. Already in 2007, Robert Samuelson remarked that even as countries become more economically interdependent, they also grow more nationalistic. He called this phenomenon the new mercantilism. Many countries emulate policies of 18th century Europe aimed at advancing each country's political and economic interests. Boosting exports and obtaining a large trade surplus were the ways to secure national prosperity. However, the world could grow and prosper only after this policy was replaced by free trade and the focus on the country's comparative advantage. According to some data from the World Bank, in 1990, trade represented about 40% of world GDP, and by 2004, it had exceeded 55% of the world's GDP. Many countries benefited vastly from this economic activity by allowing them to specialize in manufacturing, services, and research. A major problem associated with the myopic pursuit of national economic interest is that it destroys trust in international cooperation. One doesn't have to embrace Francis Fukuyama's analysis of high versus low trust societies in order to buy into the idea that trust is the lubricant of global capitalism. For those of us who practice and study management and organization, trust is very valuable for explaining the cooperation between economic actors. Research over the last 30 years has shown that economic actors who trust each other are more effective at solving problems, making decisions, and taking actions. Many of the problems we face today are global in scope, including the threats to the sustainability of the financial system, the natural environment, poverty, or illiteracy. Solving such problems requires international cooperation. Thus, a relevant question is to what extent the revival of economic and political boundaries builds or in fact undermines trust among cooperating parties. For a start, building trust requires that we remain open. As the saying goes, you cannot shake hands with a clenched fist. The topic of this symposium is of concern to current as well as future generation of leaders who may need to restore trust. The Wings of Excellence Award ceremony gives future leaders a voice today and reminds us that that's what we decide and do today, in fact, impact on the lives of future generations of leaders as well. That's why we are here on stage today with an eminent panel of students, excellent essays that have gone through a very, very tough screening process. First out in our list of speakers is Awardees Tran Vidis from the London School of Economics, who wrote an essay entitled Building Bridges or Raising Barriers, Reconfirming the Boundaries Between the State, the Market and Society. He's actually, as far as I learned, the only Greek student participant. Next year we have to have many more Greek participants, but actually he said that might come from the fact that there is too little sun in St. Gallen. But you will see later on today we'll have some sun. But what is very nice is actually he told me that he aspires to become a professional Swiss Alphorn musician yesterday, which is really, really quite impressive. And you know, yesterday he had his share of practice in the Swiss Alps and he was really bit by this and he's going to exercise a lot in the future. Let's give Awardees Tran Vidis a very warm reception.
Thank you very much. I was thinking of a title for my essay a few months ago. A title that would express my concerns and my doubts about heavy government spending and borrowing. And I remembered that a year ago, while I was walking by the London School of Economics bookshop, I saw a very interesting book written by a very famous sociologist, Anthony Giddens, about Gordon Brown becoming the Prime Minister of Britain at that time. And the title of the book was Over to You, Mr. Brown. Over to You, Mr. Brown. And I said, what a brilliant idea. I can put a title and name my essay Over to You, Dear Taxpayers, to express Over to You, Dear Taxpayers. But I decided to be more politically correct, and I chose a much more conventional title for my essay. But I'm going to talk about another very popular motto these days: extraordinary times need extraordinary action. I would add that extraordinary action is usually followed by unpleasant surprises, unintended consequences, as I argued in my essay. It was unintended consequences that had previously put an end to hitherto promising economic policies. Remember, for example, the old-fashioned income policies or fiscal policies, or the history of fixed exchange rates. In this crisis, it has been the unintended consequences of private economic decisions that triggered that credit crunch and led most economies into recession. Now, it might be the unintended consequences from our response to the crisis that may prompt the next one. Indeed, governments have taken unprecedented and aggressive action to respond to the unfolding crisis. I have heard some suggesting that governments should be given the power to prevent markets from expanding too much. I doubt about the plausibility of these proposals. And I would ask you, is constraining globalization feasible or is it desirable? Who can constrain globalization and whose interests will drive such a decision? I would argue that we may be able to confront the economic challenges, and I say may with a degree of modesty, not with a top-down approach and unilateral government action, but with cooperation between the private sector and the government. The aim is to put in place the right incentives driving economic decisions with an approach from the bottom up, if you like. This suggestion is resting on my understanding of the root causes of the crisis. The conventional opinion holds that the financial market crisis has been a monumental case of market failure. The same view is now calling the state to interfere and regulate the markets so that firms will not engage again in risk-taking banking activities, which had generated the toxic waste and had triggered the economic tsunami that followed. In a nutshell, the mainstream view is that we have had a market failure which is calling for and justifying state intervention. Well, there is something problematic about this line of argument. I would accept that this crisis was triggered by the wrong incentives governing the behavior of banks. The story has been told many times. Rewards for short-term profits, which led managers to disregard the long-term consequences of their actions in their desire to get away with a huge bonus, and off they go. Indeed, those flawed incentives governing the management of firms were flaws internal to the firm. But let me now reply to those arguing that what we must learn from the crisis is that the model of open competition simply does not work. I would think of one possible flaw. The model of open competition may be wrong in its assumption that the firm is a single actor seeking to maximize profits and acting for its survival and prosperity in the long term. Understanding this is useful in explaining what went wrong. The wrong assumption about firm behavior may be to treat it as a single actor. This has disregarded the fact that the firm includes within itself rational utility-maximizing actors with different positions and interests, shareholders, employees, and managers. Those contemplating a way to prevent a crisis from happening again shall think about how to set the incentives right within the firm, so that it shall indeed act as a single utility-maximizing entity for the long term. Now, neither the state nor the shareholders saw the unintended consequences coming from firm behavior. It is thus plausible to ask the following question. If the state has been short-sighted, why should we trust the state to regulate now? Understanding what is happening within the firm does not justify a historical return to state intervention, which may this time open up the possibility for government failure. One would say that this is primarily a task for the shareholders and the managers. This is the principle of self-regulation. But we may raise a challenging objection to this proposal. Shareholders can be as transient and temporary as managers are. They may too be driven by short-term interest as they sell and buy shares in their attempt to maximize their profit, one may say. So again, who is to regulate? Who should regulate? First, all in all, buying and selling shares across companies does not mean that we do not have an overall interest in having the right incentives for the management of any firm, irrespective of what we own at the moment. Second, I would argue that it is not reassuring when politicians decide alone after being given a carte blanche. It is not reassuring at all, actually. This is because most politicians are driven too by short-term considerations. Politicians want to be re-elected at the end of the electoral cycle. This is their bonus. Many politicians stand for special interest, and some are proud to represent segments of society through their parties. Hence, proposed policy responses involving the state can have intended or unintended negative consequences. For example, experts have talked of national rescue systems for banks and pools of liquidity directly lending money. But under these schemes, lending is likely to be channeled to national clients, as this is what possibly taxpayers and national economic players may push their government for. So we are risking a return to banking protectionism. If we take into account the political cost of government decision-making, we can understand why governments prioritize their local constituencies. The central issue is that of motivation behind decision-making. While private firms are known to seek profits, we are not so sure about the objectives of government action. Do governments know everything? Are they unselfishly seeking the common good? What kind of incentives drives decision-making? Is the decision-maker wise enough? Is he always benevolent, altruistic, or is he self-interested? I would argue that we should be wary of the weaknesses inherent in any form of decision-making, both in the private sector and in the public sector. Awareness is the first step to mitigate or even prevent unintended consequences. In face of these challenges, the problem of unintended consequences, the issue of motivation behind decision-making, and the complexity of the problems we face, what is the way out? Well, apparently there are no easy answers. But I would call for inclusiveness in decision-making and for a turn from unilateral government action to processes of co-regulation between public authorities and the private sector. Putting the incentives right is a shared responsibility between the private sector and the government of the time. If self-regulation is not possible for the above-mentioned reasons, and due to the problem of coordination, co-regulation combines the inclusiveness of self-regulation with government-led cooperation. Now, there are a number of reasons to argue in favor of co-regulation. First and foremost, because there are limits to the knowledge a single decision-making organization has. We know this from market failure, and we know this from government failure. Co-regulation, however, creates economies of scale, if you like, in decision-making. Economies of scale. This time, scale does not refer to the size of the market, but to the huge pool of talented people to be included, economists, social scientists, analysts, managers, and entrepreneurs, if they all get formally involved in the decision-making process. These are intellectual economies of scale. Second, unlike top-down government action, co-regulation brings together a variety of motives, and this diversity of motives and interest mitigates the motivation problem which I referred to in the beginning. Third, if we seek to set the incentives for private decision-making right by means of regulation, co-regulation would increase the chances that the preferences, the worries, and the proposals of those directly working in the industry would be heard and accommodated. Last, there is the issue of compliance and implementation. Realistic proposals coming from inclusive processes of decision-making are more likely to generate acceptable and working rules, increasing the chances that the markets will comply. By engaging private actors in formal processes of co-regulation, there will be more chances that the shared response would put things right, or at least it will not mess it up. The key words are therefore the following: private actors learning from past mistakes, self-regulating their industry or co-regulating with the government, agreeing on rules that would put the incentives right, incentives for the long term while monitoring any unintended consequences. Rather than governments deciding alone, detached from private actors and under the false assumption that they know everything, I would suggest that it is a formal process of co-regulation which is more likely to mitigate the problem of unintended consequences and the problem of motivation. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, let's not try to restore our confidence in the economy by means of grand government intervention, grand government action, which actually involves as many risks as promises, but by investing in the strengths of our society's achievements so far. The world economy continues to lift millions out of poverty. New medicines and new treatments are being found. Great discoveries are going to transform our societies within our lifetime. These are real opportunities, and they show that there are strong economic underpinnings for our societies to build on. It is on these underpinnings the global economy will rise up again, thanks to the unlimited talent and the immense skills available, thanks to the enthusiasm of societies to excel and the determination of millions of people to get out of poverty, to get a chance to provide a better living for themselves and their families. We learn from the past and we seek a better future. Past economic crises and periods of recession were overcome by discovering and investing in new opportunities. Back in the 1990s, information technology was the new opportunity that generated jobs and profits. So what is the next big thing now that would lift our economies up? That is what we should be asking. What does the world want or need? And let us keep our faith in human creativity and imagination when we try to manage our interdependency well. Let's see this crisis as a learning process, a chance to confirm our old commitments to liberty and prosperity, both liberty and prosperity, a moment to grasp the many new opportunities that lie ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Excellent. The next speaker is our second prize winner, Jason George from Harvard University, who wrote the essay, A Strategic Balancing Act. Jason demonstrates real excellence. He actually won a prize both at the 32nd and 33rd symposium. So that's really amazing. You have to tell us at one point how you do it, actually. It is amazing. Jason is also an actor and a writer, aside from studying very, very hard. And that certainly gives us gives him some skills in conveying his messages to an audience like that. Thank you very much, and give him a very warm reception.
So this really is absolutely unbelievable to me that I could be back here at the symposium. I didn't think I could do it once. The fact that I've been able to actually be here 3 times is unbelievable. It's beyond the realm of what I consider to be possible. So I just want to say thank you very much to the jury that's given me this opportunity. I can say without any exaggeration at all that my participation in these symposia actually altered the course of my life. So the people that I had a chance to meet, the ideas that I was exposed to at a relatively young age, the connections that I made, it was something that actually affected the trajectory of the intervening 6 years since the last time that I've been here. To the students who are working very hard behind the scenes, who I'm sure you all see, the International Students Committee, and especially to the team as well, I would love to say to you, if I could, ich möchte Ihnen allen herzlich für Ihren großen Einsatz danken. Das St. Gallen Symposium ist ein ganz spezieller Anlass für mich und es wäre nicht möglich gewesen ohne Ihr Engagement. Seien Sie sich bewusst, dass der Wert Ihrer Arbeit weit über die 3 Tage im Mai hinausgeht. Vielen Dank. I'm not a German speaker. I apologize to the interpreters up there who are wondering what's going on. And I must also say one of the benefits of this conference is the ability to have enormous numbers of conversations. So I've basically been speaking to people for 2 days, and I've been affected with laryngitis for the last 2. If my voice breaks, that's why. But I think the last time that happened, where someone had to pull out for laryngitis, it was Kofi Annan. So I'm in good company with that. Let's talk about the situation. So we have a stock market crash. We have executives that are being put on the front page of the newspapers. We have companies that are going bankrupt. We have accounting scandals. We have an asset bubble. And of course, I'm not talking about 2009, but I'm talking about the first time I was here, which is 2002. This was the era of Enron and Arthur Andersen. This was the time when the dot-com bubble had crashed, just like we have a housing bubble that had crashed. It seems like the more things change, the more they stay the same. It's only been 7 years, and it's exactly the same kinds of conversations that we're having. Maybe like the ancient writer has said, there is nothing new under the sun. And I think that one of the remarkable things about this symposium is that we're able to continuously engage in the issues that are most relevant at a contemporary situation. I want to propose just 3 dimensions to think about how we can, as business leaders specifically, think about responses to this situation. First has to do with the element of risk, and one caveat actually is I hadn't heard Iris' speech before, so you might notice a lot of overlap here. Not intentional, but I hope it reinforces the message. One is the element of risk. So who bears risk? Do governments bear risk, or do companies bear risk? The second is, do we view this as an opportunity to act offensively, or do we view this as an opportunity to pull back? And the third is, how do we as managers think about the relationship of our firms to globalization? So let's talk about the first one, the element of risk, how your company versus the government takes on risk. We've had a lot of people talk about this. In fact, President Merz said yesterday that risk is something that the government cannot bear indefinitely. This should be something temporary. And so let me make an empirical observation about this. I had the opportunity to work in state government and in both the U.S. and in Canada and in international government for the World Bank for 2 years. And one of the things that you really notice from being in those organizations is that they are fundamentally risk-averse places. So let's think about this. On one hand, you have business, and business works when it takes risks, when it's entrepreneurial. On the other hand, you have government, and government works in a very different way by mitigating risks, by having a bureaucracy in place that ensures that there's stability, by having politicians who are very unlikely to want to rock the boat. And now what we're seeing is these 2 things are coming together. So I would propose as a hypothesis that the closer that happens, the more that risk shifts from business to government, the more those rewards that normally come with entrepreneurialism will disappear. And there are very valid reasons for why this happens. If you're a politician, you cannot think about a 10-year investment horizon. You have a 3-year or a 2-year or a 1-year election cycle that you have to deal with. There's also a bureaucracy that I've noticed just from being a part of. There is very little upside risk from actually taking a chance, and there's a lot of downside risk if you actually do something outside of the mainstream. Government works by following a certain set of rules, and it's good for that purpose, which is why we have government that's responsible for ensuring stability. But it's not good for doing these entrepreneurial things that involve risk. So to the extent possible, attempting to shift risk to the government will lead eventually to the shifting away of those rewards as well. That's hypothesis 1. Hypothesis 2, the decision to be offensive or to actually be experimental, to be entrepreneurial, or to be defensive. We can think about what's actually happening right now in the United States. One of the biggest things that's making the news is the automotive industry. So we have Chrysler, General Motors, and Ford, and we've heard some conversations yesterday about them. But one of the things I would argue is their decline, their current downfall is something that has been in process in the United States for 20 years, for 30 years. When did this actually happen? This current crisis is not the first time we've had any trouble with these automakers. It really started back in the 1970s. So from 1900 essentially to the 1960s, those three domestic automakers had essentially 100% of the market in the United States. And it was in the 1970s, in a time of crisis, in a time of an oil embargo, when people's preferences changed, when it looked like consumers might actually be shifting their preferences, that these companies failed to invest. And who did invest? We had companies like Toyota and Nissan and Honda, which set up plants and factories in the United States. And 25 years later, those are the car companies, functionally speaking, that is the domestic auto industry in the United States, are these transplants, because they were willing to take that risk. So I would say, to the extent that we are thinking about this crisis as an opportunity to pull back, that could lead to the long-term destruction of your firm. So for those students who are here, who are thinking about taking entrepreneurial roles, this is a good time to do it, because these big companies have a very poor track record, actually, of responding to crisis. And so there is an opportunity here for those of you who are thinking of ways to knock these big companies off. It won't happen right away, but this is a great time to do it if those companies are not willing to continue to be experimental. Is it likely that 20 years from now, Google will be the dominant search paradigm on the internet? That is very, very unlikely. Professor Clayton Christensen has come up with this idea of disruptive innovations, where existing companies are disrupted from below and their entire markets are taken away. I would hypothesize that crisis actually accelerates the process of that happening. It makes it a little faster. So for those of you who are in established firms, I would continue to move. I would continue to invest, even when it seems like you shouldn't. And for those of you who are thinking of ways to come in there and upend those existing models, I think this is a great opportunity to do that. I think the third thing that we should think about is the relationship of globalization to your firm. I think we're seeing an increased move towards parochialism, but like Minister Shanmugaratnam said yesterday, globalization is one of the greatest forces for good in the world. And I think we have to, most of us agree here that that's the case. In fact, the reason why you are here from 70 countries and you're not doing something at your local level, you're actually coming to an international forum, is because you believe there is real value in globalization. And you are here to take advantage of that globalization. I think there is a move now, perhaps, towards increased parochialism, and that could have severe consequences for both your firms, but more importantly for society. So Professor Mihir Desai has come up with this notion of the decentering of the firm, and many of you who are here in multinationals know that. You have your corporate headquarters in one country, you have your stock market listing in another, you have your manufacturing staff in a third, you may be legally incorporated in a fourth. There's a reason why you move your companies around in different places. To bring those barriers up would break off the ability to have those interchanges, which have been so valuable. But I think even more than that, we should think about globalization not about products, but it's about people. Fundamentally, it's about people. We think about globalization as goods and services moving back and forth. We talk about outsourcing. We talk about trade barriers. But really what it's about is about people. And like Iris has said and others have said, it's really about raising the standard of living of people. It's raising human potential. I would be very remiss to not support globalization forcefully because I am a product of it. I have benefited from it immensely. My parents were born and raised in a rural agricultural village in India. Their parents were farmers for as far back as we know. The fact that we can go from that to a symposium like this in one generation is thanks to globalization. And if we cut that off, we will be cutting off generations of people, millions of people, from the opportunity to exercise their full human potential. That would be a tragedy for this world. And I think one of the things that we should think about as business leaders is it is our responsibility to make those active investments in globalization. Because the government's response is generally going to be to manage it, but we need to be the ones that are driving it forward because we are the ones at the end who are really benefiting from it. We understand that. So we are the ones who should actively invest in that going forward. In conclusion, I just want to say that it's the long term that matters. Maybe one way to think about all of these different things is to think about it in terms of the long term. So we've heard a lot about reckless short-term behavior in the last few days. There's a quote that's attributed to Martin Luther. I don't know if it's true or not, but it makes for a good story, so I'll say it. He was asked what he would do if he knew that the world would end tomorrow. And he said, I would plant a tree. Think about that. Think about that in terms of reckless long-termism as opposed to being recklessly short-term. I've thought about that personally. I've committed to actually giving 100% of the prize that's involved in this to an education organization that I care about, not because I think it's charity, and not because I expect to see return on that investment in the next 5 or even 10 years, but for the long term. I believe that that's good, and it's time to actually make those investments. So for those of you who are in a position to do that, I would encourage you to actually put your money where your mouth is, because you're the ones who are managing these firms. In the long run, John Maynard Keynes said, we are all dead. And that's true. But I would also say that we are always living in the long run. We are living with the long-run consequences of the decisions made by our parents, made by the generations before them, made by generations of regulators before them. So this notion of short-term versus long-term, in fact, I think is somewhat superficial. It is always the long-term. It is always the long-term. We are dealing with the consequences of regulations that were set in place decades ago in some cases. We're dealing with forces that have started years and years ago. So we need to continue to make those investments. Larry Summers has said that there's one thing that all crises have in common, one thing, and that is that they all end. And that is, I believe that's going to be true of this one. Hopefully we will not prove ourselves to have a memory shorter than 7 years from now. But I think if we focus on, as business leaders, maintaining that risk for ourselves, continuing to be experimental, continuing to be offensive in the way we operate, and continuing to invest in globalization, in the idea of globalism, because it is up to us to show the world that that is actually a good thing, then I hope that 7 years from now, at the 46th St. Gallen Symposium, which thanks to the diligent work of the ISC will hopefully still be continuing, we will be having a very different conversation, a very different context, and hopefully it will not be about crisis, but it will be about prosperity and sustainability, thanks to the decisions that you've made in the intervening 7 years. Thanks very much.
Very good. Thank you. Now, perhaps we need to extend the session about 5 minutes because of the applause. Our first prize winner is Shofan Hoy from Hitotsubashi University in Japan. Shofan wrote the essay Boundaries as Bridges, a reflection for transnational business actors. And the jury particularly liked this essay because it takes a critical view on protectionist policies and it calls for a new type of role for the transnational company in boosting local economic growth. What is also very special about Shofan's essay is actually that he introduces some personal viewpoints, some personal experiences into the writing, which makes it also a very, very worthwhile read. What we can say about Shofan is that he's very multi-talented. He's not only a stargazer, looking at the sky, looking out for new stars, actually. He also started a restaurant with 2 tables serving traditional high-class Indonesian food. Next time I visit, I will definitely come by. This sounds very, very good. Okay, let's welcome Shofan Hoy.
Thank you very much, Professor von Krogh. First of all, I would like to express my happiness because, unlike yesterday, I think I don't see any cowbell here. So I think I could go for more than 10 minutes. Distinguished professors, colleagues and friends, it is a great honor for me to be standing here in front of all creative people from all over the world. I believe that you are also believing that this event will be important, not only for us who are attending this event today, but also for millions of people outside the boundaries of this auditorium. For making this event possible, I don't have a capability to speak German, but I think we could give a universal expression of appreciation by giving them a big applause. In light of the belief, I encourage myself to speak here in front of all great people here. Please allow me to share my ideas titled Boundaries as Bridges, a reflection for transnational business actors. Ladies and gentlemen, inspired by his travel to Bangalore, India, Thomas Friedman wrote a revelation arguing that the world is flat. Countries are no longer in a different level of playing field. All competitors, despite its historical background, are now having equal opportunities. Political and economic boundaries seemed to be fading away. Noting that Friedman put the crumbling of Berlin Wall as one primary mover of the world's flattening, one should aware that the collapse of the World Trade Center's Twin Towers was a symbol of an entirely different story. The emergence of Homeland Security doctrine created excuses for the strengthening of border control in North America. Immigration procedures getting stricter in Europe and almost all parts of the world. The so-called flat world seems to be jacked. Political and economic boundaries are still there and may be stronger in the future. The current global crisis is strengthening the presence of boundaries. Difficult economic situation forces companies to cut production costs, fire more employees, and accept fewer employees. Economic insecurity rise in personal and national level. Economic gap within and between nations are becoming more visible. A scholar on international security, Heikki Patomäki, warned that a similar situation in 1930s had led to a world war, where nations were fighting for political boundaries. Ladies and gentlemen and friends, my fellow future makers, knowing is the first step of loving. To interact with the boundaries, I think it is wrong to make an aggressive attempt to eliminate it, to try to destroy it, to try to think that this is not exist and just force and make and use our powers to eliminate it. The way we should interact with it is change it into bridges, change these barriers into bridges. So let's start with a simple question. When we look at the world map, we will see colorful, cheerful colors there, and we will see many lines, many colorful borders there. But when I was flying from Tokyo to St. Gallen, I think I didn't see any colors in the land where we were flying. So where did these colors and these boundaries and these lines were coming from? As you may aware, okay, let's see this picture first before come back to that question. So what do these gentlemen have in common? First, they have masks. And second, I think they have the similarity that they then made the boundaries are more visible. Look, when the World Trade Center collapsed, then this Homeland Security doctrine appears. And then when this guy wears mask, the guys from Mexico could not attend this symposium. My friends and I were joking about Mexico when we were arriving at the airport. The guy there, the Bulgarian guy, he's really not a Mexican guy. But we were joking about the swine flu, and he was traveling there. And suddenly, somebody asked him, "Are you really from Mexico?" Okay. As you may aware, boundaries, particularly political ones, are emanating from self-identification, which was usually brought by a feeling of insecurity. From the beginning, the emergence of nation-states was largely driven by fear. The Treaty of Westphalia, many believe it as the birth of the nation-state system. It was at first an attempt to solve the continental 30 Years' War in Europe. In Asia and Africa, nations were rising from a response to injustice created by colonialism. In short, boundaries were created as an institutionalization of protection from threats coming from outside powers. Of course, boundaries also define who is the insider and who are the outsiders. Thus, it is understandable that boundaries are stronger at times of insecurity. When it is hard to find employment, find daily needs, or fulfill their hopes, people tend to look at boundaries. In many developing or least developing countries, the popular answers for their economic and social difficulties are coming from the outside. Foreign or multinational corporations, the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, the World Trade Organizations, and the World Bank, the three Bretton Woods sisters. The popular answers were translated into a negative insider's mentality, ranging from protectionism to xenophobia. By saying negative, I am not saying that this was not baseless at all. It should be understood as a popular reaction toward an image of threat from the ones perceived as the outsider, which sometimes are not baseless. Sweatshops, poor working conditions, and natural destructions are real in many cases. Given the nature of boundaries, it is not a good idea for business actors to expand their business in developing and developed countries by not being sensitive towards the sense of boundaries. What the transnational business actors should do is not to eliminate, conquer, or forget the boundaries. Let the boundaries there to give a feeling of security and pride. Let them be a positive insiders. Then the question is, how to do it? Let me quote one saying of the Confucius. What the superior man seeks in himself, what a small man seeks is in others. It is time to learn from the East. In the Western tradition, rights are the central theme. Take human rights, political rights, economic rights, for example. Rights also appear in the business and trade world. There are rights of the companies to be treated the same as the principles of the WTO's MFN and national treatments. In the East, it is a little bit different. Harmony is the central theme. It teaches us that we should take our rights by taking our responsibilities first. To maintain harmony, responsibility comes first, and the rights will follow. Before asking people our rights, it is important to demonstrate responsibility for others, because the dignity of individual comes not from capacity to act independently, but from the capacity to act as an interdependent whole. So, this is the reflection for the transnational business actors willing to expand its business. It is important to be a positive outsiders first, before asking those inside the boundaries being a positive insiders. Smile and you will get others smile to you. And I'm smiling now. Ladies and gentlemen, this may brings us to a question of what being positive is. Some economists believe that the presence of the transnational companies in developing or least developing countries itself is a blessing. The wealth created by those huge companies will benefit the whole country, boosting its growth and trickle down to the poor. However, many cases showed different story. The premise of trickle down that higher investment will help to reduce poverty through higher employment and real wages does not always be evident. Responding to many critics, business world came with the idea of corporate social responsibility. But there are still some criticism towards this idea of CSR. A magazine, a leftist magazine, cynically say that corporate responsibility has to make money, save money, or shut the pesky campaigners up. Distinguished professors, leaders, colleagues, and friends, the CSR example told us one thing. Giving good things is not the same with being positive. Sometimes Business actors are creating CSR based on international discourse or the advices from high-paid consultants, but forget to be sensitive toward the notion of insider or outsider. Giving good things without being sensitive toward the insider's pride will not be successful, just as Dutch ethical policy towards the Dutch Indies, which now becoming Indonesia. Then what is the key of being positive? At the end of the day, I believe that the answer is simple. Be sensitive towards boundaries, realize our position as an outsider, hear the concern of the insiders, engage positively, and create harmony. By doing so, the insecurity and fear created by the outside-inside difference will be minimized. When we transform ourselves as more positive actors, I believe that the boundaries will be transformed into bridges. However, I would like to put some practical, possible strategic implementation of this abstract idea. The first possible one is the idea that we should maintain diversity in the company. According to a study by Amy Chua, throughout history, imperiums with high diversity ascend into hyperpowers, while when they start to be intolerant, they start to decline. Second, develop a learning organization. We should make an open circuit of knowledge. That means ensuring that local events become possibilities for the company and its employees to learn what works and does not work in the local context. It's just like the book by Greg Mortensen. He was a mountain hiker, and he was lost in one part of the K2, and then he started to think about making schools there. And what happened is that he found if he started by his own program without hearing the concerns of the people, that good things just won't work. It creates misunderstandings and other bad things. And then the third one is to open and down to earth. Sincere research, open dialogue with the community, make trust. It will benefit us all. Distinguished professors, leaders, colleagues, and friends, I do not intend to put an end in this discussion. However, for a final reflection to sum up our discussion, I would like to remind us a simple lesson from our faces. We have only one mouth and 2 ears. So let's hear more than talk. Saying that, I think I'm talking quite a lot. So I think it is the time to sit and hear from you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think we have time for some dialogue, some debate, some questions from the audience. Who would like to go first? You have a question here? I think we have a microphone, perhaps, or yeah. Please identify yourself also.
Daniel Walker, I work for the Swiss Foreign Ministry. I would like to say to Mr. Tran Vidis and Mr. George, we hear you. We hear you. Yes, we know that past state intervention was often not very successful. However, there is a however, Jason, with all due respect, the main message of Tharman Shanmugaratnam yesterday was, let's not refight the old ideological battles. We have to move on together. We cannot start with left versus right, in state versus the private sector. We'll have to dialogue. You talked about that. But we have to dialogue intelligently. If I use an example of the country I live in right now, which is Australia, you have an interesting dialogue, but it's a bit the dialogue of the past. It's between the reigning government, which is a Labour government, and on the other side, not the political opposition, but frankly the Murdoch media. And that is a typical battle of the past. Mr. Tran Vidis, you were asking for more government, private sector cooperation in drawing up better legislation, in making sure that future regulation is in the interest of both parties. Yes, of course we have. But we've already done that in the past. We've heard from big experts in here that both Basel I and Basel II were finally, especially Basel II, not very successful. So while we hear you totally, let's not go overboard. State is not necessarily bad. Many of us in the public sector have, within their own career, been in the private sector, even in the educational sector. That was the case with myself. So let's be intelligent and not ideological. Thank you.
Excellent comment. Who wants to go first?
Yeah.
Aris?
Yeah, I would agree with you that we should not demonize the state, and that is why co-regulation involves both the government and the private sector, bringing them together in a form of a symbiotic relationship, if I might say. They're not antagonistic. They rely and they depend on each other. And I think that understanding this from you working in the government, it shows that any form of co-regulation, process of co-regulation is going to work. Because you understand that we all tie together in a relationship of interdependency. The government needs the private sector to flourish, apparently because this is where its revenue comes from. And at the same time, the private sector wants a government which is able to enforce the contracts and build roads, for example, take some action in areas in which the private sector is not that much well placed. So I call for alternative forms of governance. I'm not calling for taking the state out, and I'm not a market fundamentalist or someone who believes that the state is the evil or the market is the evil. I believe that by moving from unilateral government action to participatory modes of governance, we mitigate the problem of unintended consequences because we bring more people into a formal process of decision making, and we also mitigate, as I said, the problem of motivation in the sense that now you have a diversity of interests that are to be heard, not just consulted and then ignored. They have to be incorporated into a formal process of coordination, and this is how I understand this symbiotic relationship being materialized onto the level of decision making.
Yeah. Very good.
So I agree with the point about ideology. In fact, I have spent the majority of my career before graduate school working in the public sector. I know that there is a tremendous amount of good that it can do. The point here is I'm thinking there are certain characteristics of how government works, and there are certain characteristics of how business works. So maybe the appropriate response is for businesses to say, we want to take the risk ourselves. And what does that mean? In practice, it means when you lose, which will happen. In fact, when you're taking risk, you will often fail. The problem is then when often we as business leaders attempt to be able to shift that off to the government. And I know there are some systemic problems here, and that's more what Shanmugaratnam was talking about. But on a practical level, our responses as business leaders to give things off to the government will eventually lead to us losing. We cannot capture only upside. So if we're going to shift the downside to the government is going to take that upside eventually. And I think it is the nature of those two sectors is different. Because one is, in democracies particularly, it's ensuring that everyone has a voice, that specific procedures are followed, that everyone is respected, that no one is subject to undue risk. And the nature of entrepreneurship, the nature of capitalism, in a sense, is very different. As we will take big risks, we'll take big bets, with the caveat that when they fail, which will happen a lot, we'd be willing to bear those losses.
Perhaps, sir, actually a kind of a way to make this work is more transition of personnel between the private and the public sector, like yourself. So that's actually an interesting. So you, in many ways, represent the solution to the core regulation problem. Other questions from the audience? Yes, we have one here. Can we get the microphone here?
Dennis Schwaninger from the University of Basel, Switzerland. I agree with you all that there shouldn't be new boundaries by new ideological fights. That calls for a new understanding between those boundaries. So what do you think should be done in order to enhance trust, to restore trust, or to enhance trust in the long term, and to ensure that those private and public sectors will be working together, co-regulating, taking risk on the other side, and doing more in a specific way and in an intelligent way? So what would you suggest for trust building in international institutions, in the public sector or in private sector?
You want to go first?
Thank you very much. I think we are very much debating about the position and the relationship between the state actor and business actors. I do believe that maybe the key is putting another actors in to put the relationship better. I mean, many bad consequences, many unintended consequences coming from mistakes created by the business actors and state actors actually could be controlled or could be monitored by the third actor. And I believe that giving more room for this third actor will be one key to balancing the relationship between the state and the business actor.
Yeah. Jason,
So I would actually very quickly echo what Professor von Krogh said, and that is experience both. So if you've ever actually worked in government, work in business, and vice versa, and you will see that there are some fundamental differences in how people think about the exact same thing. I remember when I was working in business, I would see things on the newspaper that, as someone who knew what was going on, knew that it was fundamentally not true. And then when I worked in government, you would see the way that business reacts to government, and you know that's just not true. And it's very, very hard to explain why that's not true. But you know from being there that this is far more complicated than you think. I think maybe one of the problems is we have this model, at least in America, I don't know how it is elsewhere, where you diverge. You graduate from university, and then you're either a public sector person or you're a private sector person, and never the two will meet again. And that leads to a lot of, you accrete all of these notions of what the other side is doing without ever actually understanding it. So you have these two very different worlds that distrust each other. So in short, if you have the opportunity, work in both.
It's really great practical advice. I can actually use this as a professor. I can encourage my students to actually try both worlds. I do think it does enhance the trust that we're looking for. There was a question up here. Yes. Can have one microphone. Please identify yourselves.
Thank you very much. My name is Tatiana Pop, and I come from Moldova, and I studied at the Fletcher School in Boston. I would like to thank Jason for his speech. I appreciated the idea of long-term thinking, and I think that's an essential thing that we should be thinking about. And a lot of the problems that we face today were caused by short-term thinking in the past decade and before. And I was wondering, given that it's the human nature to think in short terms, given that voters, politicians, firms, decision makers, they all tend to think in with a short-sighted mentality. What are the incentives, and how can we create the incentives to ensure that we start thinking in the long term and that we start thinking about sustainability of what we're doing? Thank you.
Jason, you want to go first?
So two very quick things. Part of it, I think the answer is regulation sets up incentives. So for instance, if you are required to report your earnings every quarter, and that leads to an expectation that there will be certain results, the government could have a hand in actually determining how that information tap is set. And second, I would actually say, and this is, I think, a general point, we have this, I think we have this tendency, like you're saying, it's very hard to think in the long term, and we like to depersonalize our decisions. We're just reacting to the system, and the system was set up that way, and you really can't blame any individual actor. And to an extent, that's true. But I would actually think it would be far more courageous if there were people here who are making business decisions, who could actually say, you know what, this looks like a bad time, but I'm going to take a 10-year investment in this factory, in this country, because I believe in the long run it'll work. And if there were people who were actually willing to say that, the accumulation of that would be enough. And now, that doesn't answer the question of how do you actually overcome the psychology of that. But I think we've now lived through enough cycles that we've seen what the short-term thinking can do. How about we try? Let's try the long-term thinking and see what happens.
Aris, do you have some?
Yeah. I think that a crisis and all these challenges are learning processes. It's very hard to anticipate what went wrong before, because as I said, we don't know everything. But we can, as long as we learn from what has happened, and also as long as our voice is included, then this mitigates, this might prevent the problem that you described. But I'm afraid there are no easy answers. Otherwise, human societies would have come up with a solution to that, not thinking for the short term. But if I come back to the question of trust, which was posed later by Dennis in the audience. Now, it would have been easy for me to come here and say, look, the private sector messed it up, and these are the reasons why it has done so. But I don't think that you build trust by doing so, or by presenting them as the villain. I mean, I argue in favor of co-regulation, because I was surprised that at this moment when we are to build the institutions for the next years to come, the private sector is down, hurt, bleeding, and actually very complacent with grant government action. This is my criticism, that it does not stand up for the right that it has to be included, because they're going to be the ones that are going to live with these regulations, and they should have a voice in these regulations. Now, to attack the one who is down on the floor, it's an easy option, it's very fashionable. But to say that it is time, even at this moment, to realize that a better process is to be inclusive and learning from the past, so that we might be better positioned to act for the long term rather than the short term. I mean, this is, I think, an added contribution to your question and to the question of trust.
Thank you. Before we move on to the next question, I just want to sort of, from my perspective, sort out a misconception. Business is not always about short-termism. If you look at Swiss companies, if you look at Swiss entrepreneurship, which this country is very known for a lot of very, very outstanding entrepreneurial activity. If you look at these people, they have always been very, very long-term. So it's very dangerous that we equate business with short-termism. This is simply not true. This is not true. And we should, what has happened sometimes is that we are forced by markets, for example, to make short-term decisions. But our psychology as entrepreneurs, as managers, is very often to build sustainable business for a long time. May I ask for one last question, perhaps? If somebody, one very, very final question, yes, from the audience here, and then we will conclude the session.
My name is Tran Vidis from Australia. My question, I mean, we've talked about government versus business. My concern is when government and business join up in an alliance against a minority group. For example, in Australia, the indigenous community is fighting a battle with the Australian government and uranium miners who want to strip mine a lot of their indigenous heritage sites. I was just using that as an example to ask about what are your thoughts about when the government and business work together, which they feel is for prosperity because you might create jobs, but then it undermines other values in society.
Shofan, you want to take it up?
Thank you very much. I think, again, it is a matter of perception. Some people start with their assumption that what they are doing is good, and see that the perception of the others are the wrongs. All of these actors believe that what they do is the right one, and saying that the other are not intellectual, not intelligent. What I would like to say here is that this position, these ideological positions of each actors should be reconsidered. I mean, we should hear more and more from the others. We should see maybe our position is not always right. Maybe our belief is not always found in reality. Maybe we should hear the others more. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We conclude the session with the perhaps most important part of it all, and that is actually to hand over the award. And I would like to start with Shofan and ask all of you to join me in congratulating Shofan for winning this year's first prize, the Wings of Excellence Award. Thank you. Thank you. The next is the second prize, Jason George. Jason, congratulations. Thank you. And the third prize to Awardees Tran Vidis. Thank you. That concludes the session. Thank you very much for being a patient and a very, very good audience and for excellent questions. Thank you.